Let me start by saying this video was a metric ass ton of work. I mean, not for me, mind you. Ed did all the heavy lifting, so make sure that you show him some love by liking the video or following him on Twitter or something, because his findings are absolutely fascinating if you consume or create video content on the web.
Someone sent me this video and I just had to do a response, and you'll see why in a little bit.
The vast majority of our B-roll has been shot on the GH4 for months, with us going as far at one point as to shoot 4K on our A cam, a Sony FS700, 4K on our B cam, the GH4, and edit on a 4K timeline with a native export of 4K video that we upload.
That is an awful lot of work to produce a 4K web video. But hey, if that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. Some people want to finalize in 4K, some people want to finalize in 1080, and some people are finalizing in standard def. It just depends on the content and what the audience is.
But this proved to be very challenging at the time. The FS700's high bitrate 4K footage was a total bear to work with. The file sizes were huge, putting significant strain on our networking infrastructure when multiple editors were working at the same time, and we experienced other workflow interruptions ranging from poor editing timeline, scrubbing responsiveness, to annoying file splitting during long clip recording, to even export errors when rendering out the final videos.
Well, I'm glad that they figured out that this workflow wasn't for them. It really depends on the camera. It's not just a matter of 4K, but it's also about the codec and what works best with your editing system. Different cameras produce different file formats, and some of them play nicer with editing than others.
So we went back to 1080p, downscaled from 4K using our external recorder on the A cam, since the FS700 sensor performs so well at resolving fine details regardless of the output file resolution anyway.
So what they're doing here is piping a 4K signal out of the FS700 and in an external recorder downsampling that 4K to 1080, which is actually a really good method to work with if you're worried about file sizes but still retaining optimal quality. You're using that 4K quality but shrinking it down to 1080, so you're getting a really clean, really crisp 1080p. However, you do have to have a really nice external recorder to do this, and those can be somewhat expensive.
So we started by taking a closer look at some of the 4K footage that we'd shot recently on the GH4, comparing the visual quality of the native 4K footage and then that very same footage downsampled to 1080p with a variety of codecs, trying to figure out how to get timeline performance perfect. And the results shocked us. When viewed on a 4K monitor, they were indistinguishable from each other. And in fact, even when compared using overlaid still captures in Photoshop and by setting the blending mode to difference, they were nearly identical.
So you really need to understand what's happening here. They're shooting in 4K, and then in post-production taking that 4K file and scaling it down to 1080p and storing it in a codec, the one they reference as Cineform. When you do this, you are getting that same high-quality 1080p that we talked about from the external recorder. You're doing the exact same thing in post-production. So you're taking the original 4K file and making the best, most optimal 1080p file that you could possibly make. When you do that, there will be very little difference between the 1080p that's been down converted from 4K and the original 4K. And that's because the GH4, what it's recording, isn't actually truly 4K. I've made other videos about this, talking about the 5D Mark III and how it's not actually 1080p, and the GH4 is the same thing. It's not actually 4K because you're dealing with things like the compression that's inherent in the clip. 4K on the GH4 is 100 megabits a second. That's far from pristine actual 4K downsampled from an even higher resolution like 6K or 8K. So if you're comparing the GH4's 4K, which isn't actually true 4K, to a really crystal clear 1080p, that difference will be very minimal.
So then was there any point recording in 4K at all? We needed to dig deeper. So we specifically recorded identical clips at 4K and 1080p natively on the GH4 camera and compared those against each other, this time with the 1080p footage upsampled to 4K.
I assume they're recording internally because of the cropping difference between the 4K and the 1080. And I don't know about you, but to my eyes, the 4K definitely looks better. And again, we're dealing with compression on both of these because we're recording internally. The 4K is at 100 megabits a second, and the 1080p on the GH4 is at 200 megabits a second if that's how they shot it. To my eyes, the 4K does look better. And this pairs nicely with my own experience. I shoot with the GH4 most of the time in 4K. However, sometimes I'll shoot 1080p for the 60 frames a second to kind of slow things down if I need to do that in post-production. And even if I'm shooting 1080p at 200 megabits per second, just looking at the image quality between the different shots that I've had, the 1080p looks worse. That's not to say it looks bad, but I choose to shoot in 4K because to my eye, there is a difference between the 4K internally recorded on the GH4 and the internal 1080p on the GH4.
So we broke out the big guns and used our proper professional grade camera, our Sony FS700, to do the same comparison. Now we can see the difference watching the files over our own local network between the upsampled and the native 4K footage, with the text on our figurine appearing to be more in focus when watching back the native 4K file, even though the camera and subject were not moved in between shots.
And that makes sense. The FS700 is a much more expensive camera than the GH4, and is probably recording a truer 4K internally or externally, depending on how they recorded this. Again, I don't know if they're using the external recorder or they're recording internally. In either case, the more expensive camera, let's hope, is giving a better, truer 4K as compared to the GH4's compressed 4K.
We also discovered that upsampling to 4K for your final export is worth the extra file size and the extra rendering time, because when YouTube detects a resolution of 4K on their side, they will offer a 4K viewing option to the viewer that features a higher playback bitrate and therefore sharper image quality on both 1080p and on 4K displays.
I wanted to leave this in here because it's really valuable information. If you plan on finalizing for YouTube, you probably want to finalize in 4K as long as your source footage can live up to that task.
Which leads us finally to the answer for consumers. Conventional wisdom would dictate that watching content at the native resolution of your display is ideal. This is something that most of our viewers seem to be aware of based on these poll results. But if you have the internet connection and bandwidth cap limits to handle it, this is not the case for online video, or at least on YouTube. Watching at 4K on a 4K or 1080p monitor yields a noticeable visual quality improvement regardless of whether the video was natively shot at 4K or upsampled, thanks to YouTube delivering the video to you at a higher bitrate.
Also, really valuable information, especially for viewers who are watching content on YouTube. Selecting the 4K option, if it's available, will give you better viewing results.
If there's anything to take away from this video, it's don't get too focused on 4K or resolution in general. In the same way that a 4K recording phone is not a professional video recording device, entry-level 4K cameras are not equal to their 4K pro-grade brethren. But don't worry, most pros are just using their 4K gear to have more flexibility during the creation of their 1080p final product anyway.
Now, this is really interesting because I don't necessarily disagree with this conclusion, but I'd probably put my own twist on it, because what I don't want people taking away from this video is thinking that they can shoot at 1080p and it's going to be as good as things that are shot at 4K. We've already established that the higher end, professional, really expensive cameras will probably shoot a better 4K than their 1080p offerings. However, on lower price cameras like the GH4, it's almost essential that you shoot at 4K if you're recording internally, because that 4K is going to handle better and perform better than shooting with a 1080p internal. Now, some people might want to shoot 1080p for file sizes, and if that's a thing, go for it. But if you're looking for optimal image quality, you always want to shoot at a higher resolution than what you're finalizing in, and most of us were finalizing in 1080p. That's why I choose to shoot 4K on the GH4, because I know that when I downsample that 4K, I'm getting as close to true 1080p as possible. Because I'm dealing with compression, I've oversampled my resolution so that when my final product is delivered at 1080p, hopefully some of those issues in terms of detail, noise, codec artifacts can be cleared up in that 1080p file. You also have the benefit of cropping and readjusting to some extent in post-production if you need to do that as well. So in my mind, yes, 4K is absolutely worth it, as long as you can handle the workflow and the file sizes, which on the GH4 are pretty reasonable. Just like I've talked about in the past, that not all 1080p is created equal, not all 4K is created equal as well. You have to know the strengths and limitations of your camera system so you can make the best final product. So since 1080p has become the common standard on both the internet and television, at least for the time being, there's almost no reason not to shoot over 1080p at something like 4K and downsample so you're getting that crystal clear, true 1080p final output.